Okay, welcome to this webinar hosted by the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre. To introduce myself, my name is Mark Hemer. I'm part of the Science Executive of the CRC, leading the Offshore Renewable Energy Systems Research Program of the CRC. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, seas and waters on which we're all situated today. Here in Hobart, where I'm based, that's the Muanina people. And I'd like to acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay our respects to their elders past and present. So the Blue Economy CRC is a 10-year program, and we've just got ourselves organised in this second year of the program to start our webinar series. This is the third webinar we've held. And the CRC is a 10-year program which seeks to enhance development of Australia's blue economy, and it's got a particular emphasis on two sectors, the aquaculture sector and our offshore renewable energy opportunities. Offshore wind offers tremendous opportunities, and I look forward to hearing about those today, but there's also a number of hurdles that need to be overcome, and I'm sure we'll hear about those also. But I just want to mention some recent results put forward by the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. So in a recent report that they've released looking at the cost and benefits, they show that for every dollar spent on offshore wind developments, there is $12 returned on the basis of economic, environmental and health benefits. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome our speakers from the development team of the Star of the South project, which is the most mature offshore wind development project underway in Australia. And I welcome our two speakers. Just to introduce them, sorry. Our two speakers, Erin Coldham, first is the Chief Development Officer of the Star of the South team. So Erin joined the team in 2018, bringing knowledge and experience from previous roles on some of Victoria's largest transport infrastructure projects. And she's driven by the positive opportunities offshore wind can bring to Victoria and in particular Gippsland. And our second presenter today is Naomi Campbell, who's the Development Director for the Star of the South team. So Naomi joined the team in 2019 following a role with the Beatrice offshore wind farm in the UK and as development manager for the Crown Estate, working on 5 different offshore wind projects. And she brings extensive knowledge and experience in the development and delivery of offshore wind projects, including approvals and environmental impact assessments. So thank you, Erin and Naomi. To all our attendees, please make use of the Q&A feature. If you, I'm sure everyone's aware of those in Zoom now, and if you're not, then I envy you. But now I'll hand over to Erin to speak. Thanks, Erin. If you can share your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. I'll just get my screen up here. Okay, that should be in presentation mode, and I will trust that somebody will tell me if it is not. First of all, I'd like to add my acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land upon which we are all meeting through this virtual format and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We're really delighted, and I was just saying to Mark and Leslie, and I give them my thanks and everyone at the Blue Economy CRC for this wonderful opportunity to speak to you. I think 2020 has been a really upside down kind of year. And it does limit our ability to get out and speak about the work that we're doing. But this opportunity to speak to, I think, hundreds of you that have registered for this webinar is really fantastic. So thanks for coming along, and I hope this is informative. I'm really delighted to be here with my colleague, Naomi Campbell. And it's really fortunate that we have this international offshore wind experience that has now come into Australia, both on our project, but obviously around the country, and we'll touch on that in the presentation. So before I get started, I'll just give a quick overview of the presentation here. We're going to give you an overview of the project of Star of the South. Normally I would ask how many people have heard of Star of the South and what we're about, but it's a bit hard to do the show of hands in this format. I will assume you have some knowledge given your interest in the topic, but we'll give you a good overview. We'll touch on our current activities and what we're focused on at the moment, which is very much the feasibility phase and the investigations for offshore wind. We'll also touch on, given the topic here today, the economic opportunity. We have recently done some of our own research and modelling into that at a very high level, but equally interested to follow the work that this research program is doing, and certainly very interesting statistic there from Mark. I think I might have to use that one in some of my future presentations, Mark, so we'll trade statistics. Finally, we want to leave enough time for questions, and I really encourage you to use the chat. We really want to make this an interactive session as much as possible, so I look forward to answering any specific questions that you have. Okay, to start off, in terms of our project overview, we do call ourselves Australia's first offshore wind project, and some of you might be aware this has been a concept, Star of the South, for quite some time. But really, it took off in 2017 when we were very fortunate, and our founders were fortunate to attract some investment, some capital from Copenhagen infrastructure partners, who I'll touch on. And then we worked very closely with the federal government to obtain a licence to allow us to go and progress these studies, recognising the potential that offshore wind could have not only for Australia, but at a more local level, Victoria and Gippsland. So we have started big with our ambitions, the 2.2 gigawatt project, and many of you will know that is one of the largest proposed offshore wind farms in the world. Obviously, we're seeing some bigger ones popping up, but certainly given Australia is quite far away, we have a challenge here in terms of attracting the supply chain and the industry and the capital that we need, certainly to get a project like this off the ground. So we do think it's important to have that scale, and it also recognises the challenge that we face in terms of replacing some of our existing forms of energy in the decades to come here in Australia, and specifically Victoria. In terms of location, you can see on the map there, 7 kilometres off the coast at the closest point, out to about 25k, south of towns like Port Albert, Woodside, Yarram, for those of you who are familiar with the Gippsland area. A question we often get asked is how many turbines? And we say hundreds. We haven't got a specific number at this stage. Being in feasibility, we are still very much focused on understanding the specific nature of the wind profile to help us select the optimal turbine. And as many of you would be aware, there are quite significant changes in technology at the moment. The advancement of the offshore turbine is quite staggering. So as well as keeping in close contact with those OEMs who are manufacturing those turbines and developing new solutions, we're also doing work to understand our wind profile. Powering up to 1.8 million homes, to put it into some context, which is equivalent to around 20% of Victoria's electricity needs. So really is quite a groundbreaking project and rather bold proposition for the area. We have reliable, consistent, clean energy. Again, it's one of the reasons why we are focused on this technology, and I'll touch on that throughout the presentation. And in terms of the land aspects of our project, we are currently looking at 3 transmission corridors. So we have our site, which you can see on the map out in the ocean, as well as these 3 potential options to connect into the national electricity network in the Latrobe Valley, which is one of the strongest points that is available. So that's a very brief overview. If I move on to the next slide, this is what I like to call our anxiety-inducing photograph of our team. You can see how close we are together in this COVID world, particularly in Victoria, where we wear masks and until recently have stayed within 5 kilometres of our home. It seems quite strange that we were all together. This was down in Gippsland in March. This is our
Okay, it looks like Erin's dropped out. Naomi, I don't know if you're able to pick it up or whether we pause and see how long it takes for her to come back.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mark. I can pick it up, I think, and then see when Erin comes back in. She was saying that we were down in Gippsland in March. And you know, we've got a picture in front of you of the development team we have at Star of the South. It's about 30 people strong. Well, that what now it's gone. Oh no, technology. Let's see if we can get it up. Hold on a minute. I have it open. Let's do this. Okay, should be able to share now. Here we go.
Thanks, Naomi.
Okay, no bother. So hopefully that's come up. Let me know if it hasn't. Can you see the Star of the South presentation, Mark?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move down. Okay, so our team, as Erin was saying, you know, we are a team of sort of international offshore wind development experts and localized, you know, sort of experts, Australians who have worked in sort of development space for, you know, many years, some of them. But we bring this kind of blending of global experience and local knowledge, and we've sort of been working in this sort of environment for, you know, since sort of middle of last year, so 2019. We've been growing quite rapidly, and as Erin sort of mentioned at the start of the discussion, that's all to do with the two key factors, which was the involvement of Copenhagen infrastructure partners, who are our investor, and they are a global offshore wind investor who have invested, you know, quite considerably in new markets specifically, but have recently opened a fund, their Fund 4, which includes, you know, sort of quite a few potential Australian supers, and will be the largest renewables fund to ever exist. So they are, you know, they themselves are a fairly new company, but they come with a lot of experience in investing in projects such as ours. So our sort of base is Melbourne, that's where our office is, but we have also opened an office in Yarram, and we are very much the sort of project that's got an ethos of being down in Gippsland as much as we possibly can. We have already started to engage the local supply chain in our environmental studies, our environmental monitoring, and I'll come on to a bit more details on that later in this programme. So let me move on. How does offshore wind work? So it's pretty simple. It's a concept that's been around for almost 30 years now in Europe. You harness the strength of the wind at sea, which tends to be more consistent and stronger than on land. You use a turbine, a wind turbine, which you know, was modelled initially on the onshore turbines. It has modifications to allow for it to be used in the offshore wind environment, but that turbine sits on a foundation. And for us, the foundation type that we're looking at is a fixed bottom foundation type. And those turbines, once installed, will be energised via array cables, and they'll be strung together in a chain, which then connects into a substation or a collector station. That substation then changes the voltage, so it's higher voltage so that it can be exported back to shore. Once it reaches the shore via these high voltage export cables, which are buried, then it will be taken to a substation again, so that basically they can start to filter out some of the harmonics that you get with wind generated electricity. So it's sort of the electricity itself does this sort of wavy thing, and you need to try and flatten that out so that you can transmit it and you're not invoking too many losses. So again, we've opted for an underground solution wherever technically feasible, from our substation to the existing terminal stations that are already present within the Latrobe Valley. And Erin mentioned, you know, that we are looking at the one of the areas of Victoria that has the strongest strength in its national electricity grid, and its existing grid, and then it goes off to power homes in Victoria. Typically timelines, For an offshore wind farm, it can take between 6 and 10 years to develop and build. We're in the feasibility stage still at the moment, so we've still got a fair way to go. But we're very confident, and our studies to date are really starting to give us much more empirical data that this is a great site for projects such as this. But we still have a long way to go to get to the point where we can start that construction. I see Erin is back.
Thank you. I made it back, and I do apologise for the loss of internet connection. So I've got someone driving the slides. I assume that might be you or Sophie, Naomi. So we might just go to the next one and we'll pick up from there. Okay, so why offshore wind in Gippsland? And Naomi obviously started to touch on this point. And essentially, we have really good conditions for offshore wind. First of all, suitable sea depths between 20 and 40 metres, which is suitable for the fixed foundation type that we are looking at and that is widely used around the world. We've got the potential to improve Victoria's electricity system through using that grid capacity in the Latrobe Valley, as well as the good suitable wind conditions. And I'll touch on that shortly on the next slide. Why offshore wind? I think that this group has probably got a good understanding, but essentially it's the scale and the speed that that growth is happening around the world. Australia's got a real opportunity to capitalise on that growth. And certainly there are some good job and economic benefits that we'll also touch on. So if we go to the next slide. What we wanted to do was just point out it's a really interesting conversation as our electricity system starts to transform into a more variable renewable system, and some of the risks that brings compared with our traditional forms of energy generation. And one of those is naturally that wind and solar and all of those technologies are very dependent on weather patterns, and they are variable. So one of the benefits of an offshore wind farm is that it does diversify your energy supply. It's a different kind of resource to what occurs onshore, given the topography and some of the issues on land, or limited sites, as you might say. But importantly, it is also, in terms of our project, being proposed in a different part of the state that is subject to a different weather pattern. And you can see on the map here, very high concentration of renewable energy development, specifically wind farms in the west of Victoria, where there are very, very good wind conditions onshore, but limited opportunities for the east of our state in Victoria. You can see that's where the coal-fired power systems are and where we're proposing our project. So what we did was actually looked back in terms of understanding the site, 30 years worth of data from the Bureau of Meteorology to understand the link between that diversification factor. And what that did tell us, in fact, is a very strong meteorological link between hot days, hot weather, high pressure system coming down from the east, and strong offshore winds. So it's been a really interesting discovery and finding for us this year, in terms of not only is it adding scale to Victoria's renewable fleet, but it can also add that diversity so that you're increasing the availability of renewables across the whole grid around the whole year at different times of day. It's a really interesting point. To the next slide. So now we'll just give you a quick overview on our current activities, and really for us the focus is on understanding the local area. We have been doing a huge amount of work understanding both the marine environment and the onshore environment. We've had marine mammal surveys, so looking at all kinds of species, birds, migratory birds. I'll touch on those a little bit later. You can see our planes there, which have been going up every month essentially to look at those migratory species. Fish surveys, working very much with local fishermen where we can, as well as experts looking at the different fish. Wind and wave monitoring, geophysical studies. There's a picture there of us in Lakes Entrance earlier this year. We're very lucky to get our 2-week survey done of the seabed just before COVID really took off here in Australia. And our onshore ecology surveys, which have also been ongoing. There have been some challenges in terms of those activities, but we've managed to get through them, which is great. And what we're seeing is at this stage, of course, there's calibration of data that needs to occur, but certainly we are seeing confirmation that this is a good site, and we will continue to build that knowledge and baseline around the environmental conditions. Next slide. A really important point, and we've talked about obviously the wonderful opportunity that offshore wind brings, but I just want to touch briefly on our marine ecology survey program. And it's such a critical part of our planning and our feasibility work. And what you can see here is just some of our partners in this process. So we have a marine ecology survey program, which essentially brings together 30 years worth of global offshore wind experience. So people like Naomi and some of the businesses here who have been working in an offshore environment for quite a while, but also those the local knowledge from scientists here locally, academic institutions, some of which I know are also partners in CRC. So really, it's about bringing those experts on board, not only just to design the program, to go and capture the data, but equally to peer review. So we have marine scientists who have designed the program, we have peer reviewers who have suggested improvements to that scope, we've made those changes, and it is a real iterative process that will continue the whole way along, as well as introducing obviously state and Commonwealth regulators, which I'll touch on shortly. Next question, slide, sorry. So this really gets to the heart of, again, what we're focused on, which is the assessment, approvals and regulation. What is the environment that we're working under? I mentioned that we have an exploration licence that's currently governing our activities. We also have referred our projects under existing state and Commonwealth environmental legislation with a confirmation that we will undertake a full environment effects statement and an environmental impact statement for this project, which is great to have that process. It enables a very transparent investigations of the potential effects and impacts, as well as an opportunity for many people to be involved and comment and have their say through that process. And we do expect, given the level of data collection, 24 months of baseline data, this will take around 2 to 3 years to complete, but it is critically important that we understand that landscape under which we're working. At the same time, many of you will be aware, we currently don't have a legal or regulatory framework in Australia that enables offshore clean energy projects, but we've been very encouraged by the work of the federal government on the Offshore Clean Energy Bill, which some of you may have seen earlier this year, a discussion paper released, and certainly some good work being done from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources to progress that bill to a phase where it can be introduced into the Parliament. And certainly I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome the federal government's budget commitment in recent weeks of $4.8 million over the next few years to progress this really important work, which will help resolve licensing matters and the rules and requirements that will govern offshore clean energy projects through construction and operation. We're very much involved in that process, and I encourage you to reach out with any questions on that to the government or equally to ourselves if you'd like more information. Next slide. Fishing, and once again, I know this is a very relevant topic for this audience. It's a critical part, and what we have really been focused on is understanding once again what activity is occurring out there, what type of fishing, whether that's commercial or recreational, what would an operational wind farm mean for fishing in that particular area. And very much from the outset, we've been very keen to acknowledge the commercial rights of fishers. The rights of commercial fishers and understanding their operations. I think that's one of the biggest topics in terms of the offshore wind industry overseas and materialising, and some great lessons that we can learn here in Australia to make a good situation. We do believe that fishing is compatible with offshore wind farms once they're operational. Obviously, there are some issues that need to be explored, and that's what we're keen on doing. A couple of pictures here. I was really delighted to attend last year the Seafood Directions Conference and meet a lot of folk, maybe some who are on this call, but equally people with different interests. And I was really actually blown away by the level of interest from people in the fishing industry about the blue economy, employment opportunities. You know, what does this look like? How can this make our industry better? So that was a fantastic event. And since then, we have, as I said, been having some more one-on-one conversations with fishers, working with industry bodies, and doing our own research and surveys out in our licence area together with our collaborators and research partners, which is ongoing. Next slide. Community and landholder consultation has also been a very important part of our work to date. We are always talking to people in the local area, whether that's Gippsland or other stakeholders with a broader interest in our activities. And from time to time, we do run formal consultation periods where we have key information to share or need to gain some input into some of our decisions. So we did run a phase of consultation both in 2019 and 2020. Certainly what came out of that was a strong interest in local jobs and industry opportunities as the #1 benefit that the region sees for this project, as well as being mindful of any environmental impacts given the natural beauty of Gippsland and surrounds. Fishing was also a theme, as I've just touched on, as well as really a keen interest in how our site investigations are going and setting up the project for success. We've done some community research, which is really interesting to understand what people think of the project, not just the highly engaged that are going to come along to your consultation, but everyday people who are living in these communities. And what it did show through some random telephone and online surveys is 86% positive or neutral sentiment towards the project, which is really encouraging. Of course, there will always be concerns with a big project like ours, and we take those very seriously. But broadly speaking, there's a strong appetite from certainly the Gippsland region to see continuation of energy in their region. In terms of our other activities, we have established a community advisory group, which met for the first time yesterday, and we're having ongoing discussions with landholders around our potential transmission corridors. On to the next slide. I think we've got just a little, some more results of our research, which again is really interesting to understand people's views. And we found that there was fairly good awareness of the project, given we're still in feasibility phase, but certainly people seeing the benefits and locals really agreeing that big investments in renewable energy is part of a positive future for the region. 81% said jobs in energy are urgent for the future of Gippsland. And interestingly, some of the results of people's views of why they feel supportive towards the project, certainly being offshore, I think is a key selling point, and why a lot of countries have chosen to go offshore, because it doesn't conflict with existing land uses, and also that it's cleaner in comparison with other technologies and forms of power generation. I think we just have a few more slides on the local jobs investment and the economic opportunity, which we'll go on to now before we start for some questions. So this is really one of the, as I mentioned, key reasons that people are excited about offshore wind, particularly in these regional areas that do face some economic challenges. And what we have found, we've done some modelling with a company called Alpha Beta Australia, where we've looked and used our offshore wind knowledge in terms of a project of our size. If you had a 2.2 gigawatt project off in Bass Strait, essentially what we found is it could result in around 3,000 direct jobs in Australia over its lifetime. Those typical jobs being marine crew, turbine technicians, support staff, and it is again one of the differentiators between other forms of new and emerging technologies where perhaps those employment opportunities aren't as ongoing during operations and maintenance phases. But certainly with the offshore environment, there would be a strong need for ongoing roles in the region. If we looked at indirect and induced jobs, this rises to an estimated 12,800 jobs. By that, we mean downstream procurement opportunities, you know, ongoing manufacturing. We also have, for example, induced jobs being jobs created through more people in the area. And some of these regional towns are quite you know, you've got shops that are closing up because there's just people that are moving away. And certainly one of the things we heard in our community advisory group yesterday is that once people turn 18, a lot of the teenagers move off to Melbourne or other areas because there's not a lot of long-term job prospects. With more direct employment in the region, that allows for those whole communities and broader businesses to thrive as well. In terms of direct investment, around $8.7 billion of direct investment in Victoria over the life of the project, with a high concentration in Gippsland, given the annual ongoing nature of 25 to 35 years of operation. And I think we have a final slide just showing some of the typical jobs. And again, this is just to paint a picture around what could materialise in the region. High voltage cable jointers, this is just one opportunity we've looked into in terms of the opportunity to reskill and train people from the electricity generation industries they currently work in. Marine coordinators are a really big part of it. And as I mentioned, the wind turbine generator technicians, that's where we see a strong potential for ongoing employment based locally. And, you know, certainly when you look at some of those declining industries, as I mentioned, not just in electricity generation, but oil and gas and other industries, not to mention the COVID effects. There are a lot of people that are looking for what is the next thing. Fishing was another one I mentioned. We sometimes put up a slide that shows opportunities for fishers, for example, to act as guard vessels and so forth. We've already had local companies engaged in our development activities in terms of those investigations that we're doing. And as much as possible, that's a priority and a philosophy for our team, is how can we have that local economic impact that is going to be positive for the region. I think I've spoken at least for half the time here to 3:30. So I'd really like the opportunity to answer any questions that you've got, and whether they come through Mark or the chat or the Q&A here. Perhaps we can go back to the full screen and have a bit of a discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you, Naomi, also for stepping in the void. So there are a few questions that have made it to the Q&A, and so I encourage everyone listening to put your questions through there, because we'll just kind of go through those. And so maybe if we work through those, I'll say them out loud just so everyone knows which question we're talking about, because I don't know that the participants can see them, but the panelists can each see them in turn, and I'll just work through them in order. So one question here is about whether this project was captured within AEMO's ISP 2019 ISP. Whether you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to comment on that. So there has been a few mentions of offshore wind. What I would say is not a strong focus on Star of the South specifically, but certainly earlier versions of the ISP, I do believe back in the 2018 version, there was a recognition of the offshore wind resource. It wasn't necessarily captured in some of those res zones, but through some engagement, we have seen in, for example, the 2020 ISP, if you look at the map on one of the pages there, you'll see that the Gippsland res covers both land and sea. So you could say indirectly we are featured there in terms of the recognition that the offshore wind resource is there. And certainly we take a keen interest in following those developments, whether they're specific transmission projects that are being proposed or other res planning, which we've seen a lot occur through New South Wales, and I think is starting to materialise more in Victoria, to understand how our project best fits and complements those existing initiatives and technologies.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Sorry, I should have said there's a broad audience, so I should make the point of saying the ISP is the Integrated System Plan, which is around grid planning, for those that aren't familiar with that. Okay, so the next question is around life cycle planning, whether that's been factored into any of your engagement sessions to date, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a question that does come up regularly. So it's something that comes up. How long can these turbines stay in the ocean? How many years can you get out of them? And maybe to touch on that point before I get to full life cycle and decommissioning, is that once again, offshore wind technology is still quite young. So I think we've only had 1 or 2 offshore wind farms around the world start to be decommissioned. They have lasted several decades. So I think as an industry, it's going to be really interesting to see this latest technology, how many more years can come out of those particular turbines. What I will say is that in our interactions with the federal government, decommissioning will be a part of the new framework that they are developing, and it's certainly typical for other projects in the global environment to have decommissioning plans, things like decommissioning bonds, which haven't necessarily been a feature of earlier offshore industries here, but I think governments are much more attuned to them, and rightly so, in terms of ensuring whether projects, foundations can be reused and turbines can be replaced, or sites can be repowered, as it's often talked about, or what are the requirements to fully decommission that site. And that will be a key part of our planning, I imagine, once we see what the ultimate regulatory framework looks like. But Naomi, did you have anything to add to that from your experience in the UK?
Only to say what Erin has said, that the decommissioning of offshore wind has already begun elsewhere in the world. And sites, you can look at the Blythe wind farm, where there's been decommissioning in the UK, and there's been decommissioning in Danish waters as well. A lot of the time the infrastructure is sort of where it's buried is left in situ, because there's been a lot of years that have passed, and habitat has grown on these structures. But the rest of the components are taken away. Recycling in offshore wind is improving. There are elements that are really easy to recycle, like the steel, but blades are often made of a sort of a polymer, which is harder to recycle, but that is coming on, and there's a lot more focus now in the industry, especially with these decommissioning of projects, to actually bring those new standards and the standards that are expected of developments in line with countries' expectations, and develop these plans for waste and recycling as we start to decommission big projects.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Just to continue through this in order, there's a couple of questions here about the cost of electricity from offshore wind, whether you want to answer that in terms of current global status and projected over the next decade or so. I know the UK has recently come out with their recent cost projections. You might like to comment on.
Yeah, certainly. And you might like to, this might be us sharing statistics again here, Mark, but certainly what I've found very encouraging, if you look at, for example, there was a Bloomberg New Energy Finance release earlier this year, which showed significant growth in offshore wind. It was record breaking, I think $35 billion worth of final investment decisions in the first 6 months of 2020 alone, withstanding COVID. So it is an industry that is growing at a phenomenal rate. I think that indicated there'd been 319% year-on-year growth and a 66% reduction in the levelised cost of offshore energy projects. So for us, it's really encouraging. Obviously, we're in a new market here in Australia. We need to understand what our conditions are like. That it's different to that market that's obviously established in Europe, as well as Asia that's emerging. So for us, we're still working through those details, and that really is part of the feasibility studies that we're doing. But ultimately, we're very encouraged by the growth of this technology and the role it could play here in Australia.
Great, thank you, Erin. So just to expand on that, I was taken aback by some of the projections out of the UK in terms of offshore wind projected to be cheaper than onshore in the next decade or so, on the basis of the increasing growth of turbine size and obviously the quality of resources. Okay, just continuing on. So there's a question here about foundations and those being a significant portion of project cost. Are you far enough down the path of knowing what kind of foundations you're looking at, and in that respect?
Yeah, so I think what we can see from our early studies is that fixed monopile foundation is suitable for our site, which is good. It's a known technology. We had a bit of a chat earlier with Mark around floating, which is obviously advancing in terms of that technology. But at this stage, we're looking at fixed monopile foundations with the transition piece. Naturally, still early days to work out exactly the cost of that, and you know, a lot more engagement with this supply chain, particularly the global supply chain, in terms of what will be most suited to our project here over the coming period.
Thanks, Erin. And I guess another question that I think you touched on and was about what size turbines you're planning, but I think it's such a rapidly growing design phase of offshore wind that I think you kind of made that point during your presentation.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what I can say is in terms of our environmental referrals, we have put in there a range anywhere, we believe, from a 5.5 megawatt turbine up to a 10 or a 12, which is starting to happen. But it really is, until we understand the exact nature of that wind profile, as well as the advancements in technology, what's going to be the most optimal. So at this stage, we have a range, but still yet to be seen in terms of exactly what type, what height, and indeed how many turbines in that area.
Thanks, Erin. Now, there's a question here kind of getting towards your marine surveys in terms of the biological surveys, in terms of what kind of information they've turned up and what kind of feedback you've had from the fishing community.
Sure. Well, I might hand over to Naomi, who is leading our marine survey program, and I can touch on the fishing. But Naomi, perhaps over to you in terms of what's coming through that process.
Thanks, Erin. Much appreciated. So thank you also, Neil, for this question. We're now 10 months into our 24-month program, so it's still quite early days, and we haven't yet got the full sort of suite of all seasons for our key species. But what I can sort of say is the analysis that we've done to date has identified that the key receptors that we thought might be there are there, in terms of the seabirds, so the likes of the shearwater when they are when they come back to Australia from their migratory routes up north, they are present in and around the site. And we have marine mammal presence, that's the Australian fur seals on the New Zealand fur seals. We also are seeing the whales now that the migratory season's fully up and running. And we have employed, if you like, a survey program that uses an array of different techniques to try and ensure that we are capturing data in the most optimal way, but in a way that is comprehensive. And we have had to sort of make some tweaks as we've gone along to address any sort of gaps. And one of the tweaks that we've made is to increase the survey effort that we've had for the marine mammals. And actually the initial results is showing that we are capturing more targets. We are seeing more mammals as a result. But yes, early days yet to know what that all means. We'll start that process of analysing that data in terms of the environmental impact assessment, program for next year, once the data set has got to a certain level of robustness. In terms of fishermen, the feedback so far, there's two types of fishers that we have consideration for. So that's the commercial fishers and the recreational fishers. So from a commercial fisheries perspective, we've done some initial studies. We've also gone out with a survey to the fishermen. And initial studies show that we have relatively low levels of catch in and around that area historically. But that there are still commercial fishers who operate specifically out of Lakes Entrance and Port Albert. So we are aware of the fishers themselves. We, as I say, have gone out to survey, and we even have some local fishers on our very recently established community advisory group. So really, at the moment, it's about striking that dialogue and then starting to work with them around how we can hopefully coexist and avoid as much as possible high levels of any displacement of commercial fishers. Recreational wise, this is quite the first, I think, for offshore wind in terms of the potential for recreational fishers here. There's not so many in the North Sea, I would say, but we see this as a potential area where coexistence could be a a real win-win for both the wind farm and potentially the wreck fishers. There's still some analysis, you know, we've got to do. We've also got to look just at the safety and the safe operation, not just of the wind farm itself, but those who are in and around the assets. You know, they're pretty solid. So if you bang into them in your boat, it's usually the boat that comes worse off, I must say. So we need to make sure that that everyone can be safe, and we've also got to work through this sort of regulation with Commonwealth Government, whereby they look at, you know, how they will want the regulation to address coexistence. So there's still some way to go, but what I would say is there's potential.
Great, thank you very much, Naomi. I'm conscious there's a large number of questions here, so I'm going to be more selective now in terms of going through the list and passing them on. So there's one that's of interest to the CRC is around. Sorry, just let me find it again. Is around whether Star of the South have discussed any opportunities around co-location with any aquaculture operations or other blue economy sectors on site. Any comments around that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly happy to take it at a high level. And what I would say is we've had, what we're really in is a relationship building phase. So like I said, it's about understanding what existing programs are out there and forming relationships with those organisations. So as we go through our planning, we can understand what are those opportunities. So I would say it's early days, but we're very open-minded, and I you know, do hope that we'll continue this dialogue with the CRC on those opportunities. And we often get unsolicited approaches just through our normal contact channels, whether it's around specific types of, you know, scouring or anything that's happening around other international wind farms and aquaculture sites that can help with this type of research and activity. So what I would say is nothing probably concrete at this point, but equally very interested in continuing those conversations with a range of different bodies.
Okay, great. Thanks, Erin. And another question here of interest is around what percent of the overall supply chain do you see coming from Australia versus the international market?
Yeah, another good question. I do think that, you know, there are some challenges, obviously, given there are really 3 global suppliers of turbines. None of those are in Australia, obviously. So that does present some challenges in terms of those existing supply chains being overseas. How can we encourage some partnerships with local suppliers to actually improve that local content? So while it's too early to look at sort of specific percentages, what we are doing even in this development phase, and, you know, an example I'd like to touch on is our floating LiDAR, our wind and wave monitoring devices that are out in Bass Strait right now. They are French technology, company called Aquaculture, sent people out last year, but partnered with a local company called TechOcean. Those TechOcean technicians are now the first people in Australia who know how to deploy those types of measuring devices, how to maintain them. Every 3 months there are vessels going out from Barry Beach. There's a really good relationship and partnership that's been set up there. So while there might not be lead contractors or operations here in Australia, we very much see the opportunity for those local partnerships and knowledge sharing that can benefit both sides. And what our role is essentially facilitating those introductions, being very upfront. One of the things we have established is an industry capability network portal, ICN as it's known, and I think last time I checked there was a couple of hundred, 200 or 300 local based companies on that. Our role is to really look through that and understand what are the opportunities, as well as engage with enterprise agencies. In Gippsland and Latrobe Valley, there are many bodies, whether it's the Latrobe Valley Authority, Regional Development Victoria, Grow Gippsland, which is a new conglomerate there, Committee for Gippsland. There's some really good information sharing going on that can help build that picture to boost that percentage. But, you know, obviously at a high level, we do have some challenges with the raw materials that typically do come from other countries and existing supply chains.
Thanks, Erin. I guess a following question in that respect is that you know, part of the installation cost is associated with a pipeline of offshore wind projects in Australia. you have a comment on that in terms of what you see beyond Star of the South, perhaps?
Sure, yeah, we'd absolutely love to have some friends, and it's wonderful this year that we're starting to see a few more projects publicly announced. So what I would say is it's been Star of the South in some respects leading these investigations in this effort, but we've been very encouraged to see, for example, the Pilot Energy project, which was recently announced, some feasibility into the offshore wind resource there. We also understand off the coast of New South Wales there is some interest. And what I would say is the recent budget commitment from the federal government of nearly $5 million to progress this policy. It does make international headlines. It does put the spotlight on us, whether that's to the investment community, suppliers. So we're very optimistic and we're very hopeful that we can build a strong industry here. There is other potential sites, obviously, that we've talked about. And as the technology advances, particularly to floating, with those deeper sea depths along our coast, there is enormous potential. So it's a little bit difficult to predict what might happen in the next year, 5 years, 10 years. But from all of our findings, we're very optimistic that an industry could follow Star of the South.
Thank you. I should check in with you. You've been very generous with your time in terms of answering questions. We could keep going for as long as you like, probably. So I'll let you say, no, that's enough. We've done our bit. But maybe if we take a couple more, if that's okay.
Sure, happy to.
Okay. So there was another question here, which I think follows on from what you were just talking about, the regulatory framework, pointing to the UK and talking to net zero policies as being an important part of the drive for offshore wind in that market. The question here is around, is there a dependency on the Star of the South business model on similar policies in Australia, or do you think it stands alone?
Yeah, so essentially what we see as the opportunity, and I'll go back to the year 2017 because it was quite significant for this project. And I mentioned that we attracted some investment. One of the other things that happened in 2017 was that the Hazelwood Power Station closed March 31st. So that immediately started to tell the market that there is existing generation that is starting to exit the market. There is going to be needing something to replace it. And from our perspective, whether that's solar, whether that's wind, we just know that there's going to be a need for reliable power supply. And for the reasons that we've outlined in terms of that diversification of the resource and the reasons that other countries have gone offshore, it's something that we can see happening in Australia here. And while some countries have chosen to go that way, certainly Denmark and the UK very much strongly on a climate platform or linked to their climate policy. The reality is there are many other reasons that we sort of touched on. Number one, essentially being the need for reliable, secure energy into the future and for that to be deployed at scale. Or whether it's in the next 5, 10, 20 years, it is something that Australia is heading towards. So it makes sense for us to be here, but certainly not dependent on having those kinds of commitments, perhaps, that other countries have chosen to go with.
Okay, great. And maybe I'll make this the last question because it's kind of a nice general one in terms of, what you consider have been some of the major hurdles that you've had to overcome to this point, and does that make it easier for the following projects? And I guess what do you still see on the horizon in terms of significant obstacles for the project?
Yeah, good question. It's the tricky one right at the end. No, it is a really good question. What I would say is, this project has been a very pioneering project, and to pay some acknowledgement to the founders, the 3 Australian founders who saw this opportunity, who put Gippsland on the international map as a suitable place to come and invest in offshore wind. We owe a lot of credit to them because the reality is it's new, and I think with any kind of technology, sometimes it might get bundled in, oh yeah, we've got wind farms. Well, the reality is that offshore wind is a very different proposition to what we see onshore, which is quite an established industry here in Australia now. So certainly I think just creating that awareness around the differences between the onshore and the onshore and the offshore, energy sort of markets, and things like ports and harbours and all of the logistics, all of the complexities with building out at sea, the existing users out there, it really is something that needs to be worked through. And often people say to us, you know, why can't it happen quicker? But we do need to be respectful that there's existing industries offshore. There is a marine environment out there that has not a lot of data around it in terms of what's happening. So I would not necessarily focus that on a challenge or an obstacle. I actually see it as a really fantastic opportunity, as I say, to bring those lessons from Europe. It's been done elsewhere, so it can be done, but how do we take those lessons, take the best of what people like Naomi and my other colleagues have done in other countries, and bring that to Australia to set up a really good regime. And I think we're doing that, and that gives me a lot of hope and optimism. And like I say, we've been very pleased with the level of interaction with government on that regulation. And I think in terms of obstacles still to come, it's hard to predict the future. I don't think many people would have predicted a global pandemic this year. That certainly threw a few curveballs for Naomi and her team in terms of getting those planes out and boats out to keep collecting that data. But really it is just this ongoing conversation around the energy transition and how offshore wind can play its part, certainly amongst a suite of other options that our country is looking at.
Thank you very much, Erin. That's great. And so thanks, Erin and Naomi. You've both been really generous with your time. Really appreciate you giving a webinar to our Blue Economy CRC audience. And just looking through some of the chat and whatnot, I think it's been well received by all attendees.
Yeah, and perhaps a final word, we'd be really delighted. I've seen a few people buzzing up for LinkedIn connections. Please do follow us. We try to share our news and updates. So whether you connect with us personally or our project at Star of the South on LinkedIn, sign up for email updates, reach out to us on email. We just love talking about our project and the opportunities it presents, and understanding more about the good work of others that can help complement this going forward. So thank you.
Excellent. It's been great. Thank you. I've learned much more about the project, so I appreciate it. And just to sign off for the webinar more generally, so this is the end of our third webinar. We have another webinar scheduled for a month's time, roughly the same week of November, where we'll be talking about offshore aquaculture units and support vessels, being presented by members from DNV, GL and BMT. So please, I think call for registrations has been sent out today, but look for those on the Blue Economy CRC channels as well, and welcome along to that workshop. So again, thank you very much to the Star of the South team. Really enjoyed the webinar, and thank you all for attending.